Good day. In my video yesterday, I discussed briefly the report of the Ministry of Defense of Russia with its various announcements about the various advances made by the Russian military and the allied military, the militias of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics in Ukraine. And since I made that report, we've had further discussions from various people, better informed people in many respects than I am, people better able to assess the importance of these events than I am, based upon this information from the Russian Ministry of Defense. I'm going to just cover some of these updates so that people who follow this channel can get a more comprehensive picture of what exactly has been happening and of what in effect the Russian Ministry of Defense has told us. Now, firstly, the Military Summary channel has provided us with a fairly good explanation of the information that we're getting around the Kherson Nikolaev area. And I have to say, it actually appears to show an even more critical situation for the Ukrainians than I had actually appreciated when I made my previous videos. Firstly, as is often the case, it now turns out that there are two places which the Russians mentioned the capture of a particular village. If you remember, the Ukrainians also previously informed us about it. It turns out that there are several villages close to Nikolaev with the same name. And at this point, I'm going to just quickly say that this is an issue with all Ukraine war reporting, as we're going to see in a moment when we get to the situation in Donbass, that various villages or small settlements or townlets in this part of Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, have identical or very similar names. And it's sometimes not easy to distinguish between them. One gets a report that comes up that tells you that one particular place, Blagodatnoye, in this case, near Kherson, in Kherson or Nikolaev region, has been captured, and you don't always understand that there's more than one place called Blagodatnoye, and in fact the place that you thought had been captured is actually not the place that has been captured, and vice versa, or perhaps sometimes it's both places have been captured. Anyway, it can be confusing, and this, it turns out, is what has been happening in the fighting in Nikolaev. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this. As I said, if you want to, the Military Summary channel is the best place to find all this out. But briefly, it seems that the Russians are pushing forward up they've captured a significant area of territory near the estuary of the southern Bug River, but on the east side of the southern Bug River. Nikolaev, by the way, is also on the eastern side of the southern Bug River, and they're now in a position to push towards Nikolaev from the south, and they've also captured territory to the east of Nikolaev, so that means that they're now in a position to push towards Nikolaev from the east as well. And some reports say that the Russian forces are now within 20 kilometers of Nikolaev, both from the southern and eastern directions. Now, when I say Russian forces, I mean Russian ground forces, I mean Russian troops, Russian military formations. The Russians, for some time, have had bunkers and observation posts even closer to Nikolaev than this, within 15 kilometers of Nikolaev. But what we're talking about here are apparently actual significant forces. Now, 20 kilometers is of course well within artillery range. So, and this, would be normal tube and rocket artillery, so that the Russians, in theory at least, can now start to shell Nikolaev with ordinary tube and rocket artillery, with their 152mm guns, with their various multiple rocket launch systems, the Smerch, the Uragan, the Tornado, which has been discussed in a masterly way in a fascinating video by Brian Baletic at the New Atlas, and which it turns out is the direct Russian equivalent of the American HIMARS system. Anyway, the Russians are well within range now of Nikolaev. Now, of course, saying that they are within range doesn't mean that they're going to start shelling Nikolaev with tube or rocket artillery. First of all, if that is their plan, they have to move this artillery to these positions that are now occupied by their ground forces, and that may take time. It would mean establishing a supply system. It would mean sending large amounts of artillery shells by train or road, building up ammunition depots, doing all those sort of things. That sort of thing takes time. And having said that, it is now something that they could, in theory, start to do. And of course, it is the pattern of Russian activity in this war. They build up their forces gradually, incrementally, step by step, until eventually they have an overwhelming advantage before attacking a particular place, a location like Nikolaev, in order to try and capture it. And as I said previously, Nikolaev is roughly the same size in population terms as Mariupol was before the war. I mean, both cities, both Mariupol and Nikolaev, much of their civilian population has actually left, but that's the order of magnitude of the city that we are talking about. Like Mariupol, it's an industrial city. Like Mariupol, it's on the coast, or to be more precise, on the estuary of this big river, the Southern Bug. Like Mariupol, it is relatively easy to cut off from resupply. Ukrainian supplies have to, from western Ukraine, have to cross the Varvarovsky Bridge, which the Russians could, in theory, shell or destroy. And here, by the way, I'm going to say something. This is something which undoubtedly it is within the Russian military capabilities to do if they were to put their mind to it. Now, I've discussed how the HIMARS rockets that have been so far supplied to Ukraine are not powerful enough to cause damage to the structural integrity of the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson region, and certainly not to the Novaya Kharkov Dam and its accompanying bridges a little further to the east. I mean, briefly, the HIMARS rockets launched from the HIMARS system that the Ukrainians have, 220mm in caliber, are just not powerful enough. But the Russians possess vastly more powerful, vastly bigger missiles than these HIMARS missiles. They could, for example, deploy in theory against the Varvarovsky Bridge the enormous KH-22 or 32 missiles carried by their Tupolev 22M3 bombers. These are enormous missiles designed to destroy US aircraft carriers, but also with a ground role. And undoubtedly, if they were launched against a bridge, they would do massive damage, assuming obviously that they were to hit the bridge, which they probably would do. We're talking about precision guided weapon systems here. And there's only one of the missile systems that the Russians possess. I suspect that if the Varvarovsky Bridge were attacked by a Kinzhal hypersonic missile, which the Russians have also used in Ukraine, they've already used, by the way, the Kh-22 and 32 missiles in Ukraine. They could, however, do the same. They've also used the Kinzhal system. They were to use that Kinzhal hypersonic missile. Well, I'm sure that that would also destroy the Varvarovsky Bridge. And I suspect, by the way, that some of the rocket systems, some of the missile systems like the Kalibr and the Iskander, they could probably also, if used, perhaps rather more extensively, destroy the Varvarovsky Bridge too. Now, saying that doesn't mean that that's necessarily what the Russians are going to do. The Russians have repeatedly said that they do not attack civilian infrastructure. Well, you can take that with a massive pinch of salt, or mountain of salt. I do, by the way. But I'm just saying that they possess the capability. Now, there may be a reason why they might not do it in this case. And that is, of course, and conceivably, if the plan is to advance on Odessa once Nikolaev has been captured, that they might want to capture the Varvarovsky Bridge intact. So they might be prepared to accept the price of some Ukrainian supplies crossing the Varvarovsky Bridge into Nikolaev. This is always, of course, assuming that their plan is to capture Nikolaev. They might be prepared to accept some losses, some prolongation of the fighting in Nikolaev in return for the prospect further on of being able to use the Varvarovsky Bridge to send their forces across the southern Bug towards Odessa. Now, I would add, by the way, that once the Varvarovsky Bridge is captured, if it is going to be captured, once Nikolaev is captured, then the Russians would presumably want to send their forces to consolidate control of both sides in this area of the southern Bug River. And remember that they deployed before the war 7 large amphibious landing ships of the Alligator class to the Black Sea. Now, there's been much speculation about the fact that these ships would be used for an amphibious assault on Odessa, something which has never happened. I think it's more likely that these ships are intended to be used for resupply. That's what they've been used. Those class of ships have been used by the Russians to resupply their forces in Syria. They're roll-on, roll-off ships, so they're very capable of being used for resupply. If there's going to be an advance westwards towards Odessa after Nikolaev falls, it seems to me that the most logical thing would be to use these ships, these 7 ships. One of them was sunk by Ukraine, by the way, back in March. But we've been getting reports over recent weeks that the Russians have raised it from the sea surface and repaired it, which suggests that the Russians still intend to use it in some capacity. Anyway, what I think the Russians will more likely do with these ships is use them to resupply their ground forces. And of course, ships can carry quite a lot of equipment. They can carry a lot of ammunition, a lot of hardware, and you can actually use them to resupply forces if the intention is to advance westwards. All very speculative, but I'm just making those points. I'm not sure that the Russians will attack the Varvarovsky Bridge. I think more likely than not, at some point they will advance on Nikolaev itself and will want to take Nikolaev. I've always said that I cannot imagine this conflict ending without the Russians doing something to take control of Odessa, a city which features very high in the Russian imagination. It is a alluring prize for the Russians. By the way, there was a display of a Russian flag in Odessa a few days ago, where the words Odessa is a Russian city. So, Russia has a lot of support and sympathizers in Odessa. But also, of course, and importantly, if Odessa is eventually brought under Russian control, then that will mean that Moscow has control once more of the entire northern shore of the Black Sea. And I think that is something of strategic significance for the Russians, independent of the fact that it would also obviously cut Ukraine off from access to the sea. So I personally think that at some point, some advance on Odessa must be in Russian plans, and I think that this means that some sort of advance on Nikolaev is plausible. Now, it wasn't just about this push towards Nikolaev that we're starting to get some more information, because the Military Summary Channel also pointed out that the Russians appear to be reporting news that they have pushed the Ukrainians back from the area where the Ukrainians had established some kind of crossing of the Inhulets river. This is a crossing that the Ukrainians were able to make. They haven't been able to advance south of that crossing. All their attempts to do so have resulted in the Ukrainians suffering very, very heavy losses. But they clung on to that crossing, and it was all intended, presumably, to form part of this counteroffensive Ukraine was supposed to launch in Kherson region, and which has, as we've seen, failed to materialize. Well, if this report from the Russian Ministry of Defense is correct, then it looks as if the Russians have either eliminated this bridgehead that the Ukrainians have been clinging on to south of the Inhulets river, or as if they are in the process of doing so. Now, again, this is a rather sketchy report, but that would also tend to support my view that what is happening here is that the Russians are planning a further advance westwards towards Nikolaev, and that they want to eliminate this threat to that advance from the Ukrainian forces in the north, which have been trying to press into the flanks of the Russians across the Inhulets river. Well, that's where we are in the events in southwest Ukraine. There's also more explanations now of what's actually happening in Donbass. And it seems that I made a mistake in my program yesterday. I said that the Russians, or at least various people, various reporters on the ground, had previously reported that a place called Zaitsevo had been captured by the Russians, and that this turns out, or at least by the Donbass militia, and this turns out to be untrue, because the Russian Ministry of Defense was saying that the forces, the Allied forces, are nearing Zaitsevo, which by definition which is supposedly, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, a pivotal part of the defense of Bakhmut city. But the fact that they are nearing Zaitsevo means that they haven't actually captured Zaitsevo. Now, somebody wrote to me very helpfully by email, and I'm not going to identify this person, though I understand that this person has a YouTube channel, but I'm not going to identify this person because it's a private email, and I make a principle of not identifying people who send me private emails unless I have their permission to, and for the moment I don't have that permission. But anyway, this person pointed out to me that there are actually two places called Zaitsevo. The Russians did, or rather the Donbass militia did capture another Zaitsevo together with another place called Dacha, and that the Russian Ministry of Defense is referring to yet another, a different Zaitsevo, which confusingly is in the same general location. So we have two villages, both called Zaitsevo, Zaitsevo 1 and Zaitsevo 2 if you prefer. The Russians, or the Donbass militia, some time ago captured Zaitsevo 1, and now they're in the process of approaching Zaitsevo 2, which the Russian Ministry of Defense tells us is this important place pivotal to the defenses of Bakhmut city. And in fact, as the military summary channel also explained, we now have information that Kadema, this other place pivotal to the defenses of Bakhmut city, that the Ukrainian forces in holding this other village or small town or suburb of Bakhmut city, whichever you prefer to call it, Kadema, that the Ukrainian forces there are operationally encircled, and that their fate in effect has been sealed. They can either go on fighting, or they will have little choice but to give up. And all of this, together with continued pressure on Ukrainian forces in other places like Bakhmut and Soledar, all of this points to a steady progress towards encircling the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. The Ukrainians, by the way, have now confirmed that the Wagner group, this I'll call it a mercenary outfit, but Russian paid volunteers fighting as part of this umbrella organization. Apparently they're some of the toughest troops anywhere on the front lines, that they're now in control of the eastern part of Patrice Lumumba Street in Bakhmut city. And anyway, it doesn't seem as if the Russian plan is to encircle Bakhmut city. By the way, the Indian diplomat M.S. Bhadrakumar, who is one of the most insightful commentators on geopolitical events, but who, as I've long suspected, I'm sure that he's getting a great deal of information, probably advice from various Indian military officials. The Indian military is a very sophisticated organization, and there are some extremely insightful people within the Indian military, or so I understand, who are able to give quite a lot of advice to Indian commentators about the direction of the war, though I would say, it's a mixed bag. You get some who are more insightful than others. But anyway, M.S. Bhadrakumar has said that the encirclement of Bakhmut is only a matter of time. And as I've said previously, Bakhmut is the pivotal point in Ukraine's control of the remainder of Donbass. So we are now in that position where it looks as if the days of Ukrainian control of Bakhmut city, well, let's not say that they're numbered, because we don't know how long this fight is going to continue for, but it's beginning to look as if we are entering a situation rather like the one we saw with Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. And I should say that given the volumes of ammunition that both sides are using in this fighting. If Ukrainian forces in a place like Bakhmut are encircled, then the extent to which they can continue to resist, then it does become numbered in weeks, if not in days, because very quickly at that point they will start to run out of the ammunition, the artillery ammunition especially, that they would need in order to be able to continue fighting. So that's where we are. Bakhmut, progress towards its encirclement, a major advance by the Russians in western Ukraine, getting ever closer to Nikolaev, almost certainly planning to capture Nikolaev at some point. And also the Ministry of Defense, as I said yesterday, is now reporting that Marinka, this other fortified village, is likely to fall soon. And the major Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka, a much more important settlement, much bigger settlement, where much of the Ukrainian artillery that has been shelling Donbass has historically at least been located, that's in the process of being encircled as well. So despite what you hear, steady incremental progress in Donbass, it's Russians hammering away at Ukrainian positions, gradually, steadily taking bit by bit of the Ukrainian defenses, weakening the Ukrainian defenses until the key fortress, which is Bakhmut city, itself becomes encircled and then collapses. And then a large area of the front lines will collapse as well, probably all the way up to Siversk too. And then, of course, the Russians will move on to the next concentration of Ukrainian troops, which is the last one in Donbass, which is Slavyansk-Kramatorsk. And that is in sight has received further confirmation from the fact that Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, he's had a meeting in Donetsk city with the head of the Russian parliament, who's been visiting the Donbass. Now, the Ukrainians apparently got wind of the fact that this person was coming, and they shelled the administrative building that is the headquarters of the Donetsk People's Republic government, possibly hoping to hurt or kill or wound this important Russian official. But anyway, that didn't happen, almost certainly because the officials in Donbass, the officials in Russia, knew that that risk existed, and the meeting took place somewhere else. But anyway, the long and the short of it was that, as well as apparently discussing the future rebuilding of Donetsk city, Pushilin came out and said that there will be a referendum in Donetsk about unification with Russia, but that this will only happen once the whole of Donetsk region has been cleared of Ukrainian forces. And he seemed to be speaking as if this is now something that is now within the time horizon, the visible time horizon, which suggests that the Russians are becoming increasingly confident that that Bakhmut city itself is likely to fall before very soon. And my own view, and I've said this previously, if Bakhmut falls, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian positions there become untenable, especially as it seems that Ukrainian positions in southern Donetsk region, opposite Donetsk city, that they're also crumbling as well. The Russians, as I said yesterday, Russian Ministry of Defense said that 75% more than 75% of Marinka, this other fortified village, has now also fallen under Russian control, and that the militia is now in the process of capturing the remainder of Marinka, and that this is now only a matter of time. And it seems that the Russians are pressing, or rather the militia is pressing forward towards capturing or surrounding Avdiivka, and that they are clearing positions, Ukrainian fortified positions, around the Donetsk ring road, which is the second line of defense, or the next line of defense behind these fortified villages like Pesky and Marinka, which are now in the process of being captured. So we could see that there's incremental progress being made. By the way, we've not had reports about what's happening in Zaporozhye region, what's happening in Ugleda, which is this important fortified area and transport hub in southern Donetsk region. I'm going to suggest that I suspect that probably quite a lot is happening there. I'm going to provide an explanation why I don't think we're getting this information as readily as we get information from the Donbass, from the actual fighting in Donbass. And in addition to that, we're not getting a huge amount of information about what's going on around Kharkov. But again, I don't think this means that there is no fighting going on in and around Kharkov. On the contrary, I suspect that the Russians are pushing further south as they gradually, step by step, move towards encircling Kharkov. And as I've said just previously, the fact that the Ukrainian authorities are becoming very nervous about their hold of Kharkov is highlighted by the fact that there are now searches, that the Ukrainian authorities are carrying out searches in Kharkov of people who they think are potential Russian spies in the city, something which we previously saw happen in Nikolaev. I think we can say now definitely that when it happened in Nikolaev, it was a sign that things were going badly wrong for Ukraine. In Nikolaev, the fact that the Ukrainians are carrying out the same kind of searches in Kharkov, combing, if you like, Kharkov for Russian collaborators and Russian spies, that's a sign that things are not going well for them there in Kharkov either. So that's, I think, where we are on the battlefields. Now, I'm going to now discuss a point which I made before. I'm going to return to it because I think this explains a lot about the nature of the fighting in Donbass, and I think it also explains a lot about why we're getting more information from some front lines rather than others. Now, the thing to say is that what we refer to as the Russians in Ukraine is actually a mixed force. There's the Russian army, the Russian regular forces, which are the principal forces carrying out the operations in Kherson region, in and around Nikolaev, and to a great extent in Kharkov region, and which were the forces that captured Izium way back in March. And we also have the militia, the Donetsk and Lugansk militia, and supplemented by various Russian formations from the Rosgvardia organization, the Chechen forces that have been extensively used in the fighting in Donbass, and of course this rather curious outfit, the Wagner outfit, with its paid volunteers, ex-Russian special forces, I suspect mainly, who are apparently some of the best fighters in the war. Now, I've explained before that, in my opinion, most of the infantry fighting, the light infantry fighting in Donbass is being done by the Donetsk and Lugansk militia, supplemented by Chechen troops affiliated to the Rosgvardia organization and these Wagner forces. Now, I'm not saying that the Russians are not present in Donbass. They obviously are. But I suspect that what the Russians are doing in Donbass is they're providing, obviously, much of the artillery, though the Donbass militia do have artillery of their own, and apparently some of it is very well operated. But the Russians provide most of the artillery. They provide a lot of the long-range rocket artillery, obviously. Some of the tank forces, though again the Donbass militia do have their own tanks, but I think most of the tanks operating in Donbass are probably under Russian control. They are part of the Russian armed forces. They also provide these specialist units, the ones that operate these terrifying TOS-1 and TOS-2 missile, multiple rocket launch systems which launch these thermobaric warheads, which are devastating in their effect and can destroy fortified positions and do terrible things to Ukrainian troops operating in trenches. Those are clearly under Russian control. And of course, the Russians have the intelligence, they have the drones, they operate the drones, they operate the aircraft, and importantly, they also have the overall command and control. We saw during the fighting, the last stages of the fighting in Lugansk region, that there were the overall commanders were two Russian generals, General Lapin and General Surovikin. And it's clear that those two generals, Russian army generals, were in overall command of forces which included in that fighting forces of the Lugansk and Donetsk militias. So they provide overall command and control, and it's the Russian General Staff in Moscow, presumably, which plans the overall campaign. But in Donbass, as I said, it's an allied grouping. And it's important to understand that if you're talking about allies, an allied grouping, made up, in the case of the militia, largely of reservists who have been called up to fight, reservists from the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, then it's important to understand that this has an effect on the character of the fighting. Now, what I'm going to say should not be construed as any sort of criticism of the great courage of these fighters. What I will say is this: if you're talking about an allied force, almost by definition, the component parts of it are not going to be as easy or as straightforward to command as regular forces are. Reservists and their commanders and their political leaders, people like Pushilin, have their opinions about how the battle should be conducted, and they also are people who Moscow is obliged to listen to. And very logically and very understandably, their concerns, remember these are reservists, are with steps to protect and defend their own towns and their own families who live in these towns. Now, we have seen this happen before. When there was the fighting in Mariupol in March and April, the Ukrainians launched a missile strike on Donetsk city, and I got what I think were very reliable reports that some of the militia formations that were trying to capture Mariupol, the people there were shocked by this attack on Donetsk city, where their families were located, and some of these troops had to be relocated to Donetsk city, and they were then allowed to carry out some kind of an offensive against these heavily fortified Ukrainian lines in places like Siversk and Avdiivka. Though at that point, the Ukrainian defenses were simply too strong, and they did not succeed. And that slowed the capture of Mariupol. It caused the capture of Mariupol to be protracted. Now, I should say that the capture of Mariupol involved a multiplicity of different forces. There were regular Russian military involved, to be precise, Russian naval infantry, Marines. Their commander was actually killed, leading his men into battle, which is very typical of the way the Russians conduct military operations. There were also Chechen units, but a large proportion of the fighters were these very tough, highly experienced fighters from the Donetsk militia. And if some of them were then redeployed to Donetsk city, well, that will have slowed the impetus of the Russian advance. Eventually, of course, Mariupol was captured. But I suspect that something fairly similar has been happening over the course of the fighting in Donbass. Now, there's been much discussion and speculation about why the Ukrainians continue to shell Donetsk city. And there's been many very powerful words used about this. Some have talked about terror attacks and things of that kind. And there's been some really rather wild reporting that this is all some sort of visceral act. It's Ukraine trying to sort of kill people indiscriminately. I have to say that, in my opinion, there is a very simple and very logical calculus behind the shelling. Not a calculus that I have any sympathy for, or which I countenance in any way, but it does have a kind of military logic, which is that inevitably, and again, talking about the Donetsk militia, their focus is going to be the defense, the protection of that city and their families. And it's all very well for people in Moscow to come up with intricate plans to capture places like Bakhmut and to capture other places like Siversk further in the north. But those reservists will want to protect their families and their city from this relentless Russian shelling. And what then happened, and now you can see the pattern of this, about 2 weeks ago, the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, came to Donbass. He had meetings with all sorts of people there. And one of the things he did promise, and I think he had to do this, and this was absolutely something that the Russian leadership accepts has to be done, he promised that there would be steps taken to bring this constant shelling of Donetsk to an end. And that meant that there's been this offensive, this very successful offensive against Donetsk city, and it's one of against the Ukrainian positions opposite Donetsk city, which is where much of this artillery shelling of Donetsk takes place from. And given that the Russians have been giving it their full backing, and given that the Ukrainians were, and I think this is now largely acknowledged, unwise enough to withdraw troops and artillery from this area, to redeploy them to Kherson region in support of their offensive. This offensive, this militia offensive against these Ukrainian troops opposite Donetsk city has gone amazingly well, amazing at least to people like me. So you've seen places like Pesky fall. It looks like Marinka is going to fall also. It looks like Avdiivka is going to be surrounded before very long. And it looks as if, again to the surprise of many people, there's some success in clearing Ukrainian fortifications along the Donetsk ring road. So we're starting to see advances happening. We're not starting to see, we've seen significant advances happening alongside in this part of the front line. But what that does mean is that you are attacking in more than one place. You're attacking the most heavily fortified area of the Ukrainian front lines, which is opposite Donetsk city, rather than concentrating on taking Bakhmut. Even though, by some calculations, according to the opinions of some people, according perhaps to my highly inexpert opinions, and I stress again, highly inexpert. I know there's been some ridicule about my repeated comments that I'm not a military expert, but it's true. You know, I'm somebody who's followed events closely in this war, and I've learned a lot, but I don't have a military background. Anyway, putting that aside, what all this has meant is that inevitably, if you are deploying many forces to break through these very heavily fortified lines opposite Donetsk city, that means that you have fewer forces to take positions around Bakhmut city, places like Adema, the two sites of Oz, a settlement called Dacha, and of course also Soledar and Bakhmutsky. And that, I suspect, explains why the fighting around Bakhmut city is taking longer than it might otherwise have done. It doesn't alter the fact that eventually, as MS Badrakuma says, Bakhmut city will be surrounded, but it does explain to some extent the dynamics of the fighting there. I'm going to say something else. I think this also probably explains some of the dynamics of the fighting further north in and around Siversk. Now, when Lysychansk fell, there was widespread speculations that the next and most logical target for the Russians to capture was Siversk. And the authorities of the Lugansk People's Republic announced on 2 occasions that Siversk had actually been captured, which turned out, by the way, on both occasions to be wrong. I'm going to make a guess that there were perhaps some plans to capture Siversk. But again, these depended to a great extent on deployment of militia, the militia in this case of the Lugansk People's Republic. Now, that militia had just cleared Lugansk of Ukrainian forces. They just captured Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and they were tired and they needed to rest and refresh, and though unquestionably they were willing to help in the capture of Siversk, possibly their hearts weren't in it to the same extent that it was the case when they were fighting to take Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which are in Lugansk region. Siversk is in Donetsk region. It's in a different region. Now, I don't think you should make too much of this. I think that we're talking about a Donbass identity more than a Donetsk and Lugansk identity. But you can see why soldiers, militia who've been fighting to free their region of the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian occupiers, as they would say, might be a little less enthusiastic about capturing a place like Siversk in a neighbouring region. And I suspect this is probably why that attack on Siversk didn't get the full force behind it which it would have needed in order to succeed, and why that gave the Ukrainians time to reinforce their forces around Siversk. I would say, by the way, that I think that in the end, and I'm taking this very much now from the military summary channel, perhaps the Ukrainians went too far. It seems to me they over-reinforced around Siversk. They too fell into this assumption that this Siversk was going to be the next point of the Russian attack. And the result is that there's a very heavy concentration of Ukrainian forces in and around Siversk, many of which are difficult to redeploy because they're largely infantry. And some of those troops might have been better deployed elsewhere further south, defending Bakhmut city perhaps, and defending Ukrainian positions opposite Donetsk city, where the Ukrainians clearly didn't expect the main blow to fall. Anyway, this is all a bit speculative, but I think it is consistent with events, and it explains some of the fighting that we're seeing. I'm going to make a guess that once this war is indeed over and we start to get the memoirs of the various commanders, which is inevitable, we're going to discover, as is inevitable in war, as is inevitable in all coalition war or alliance war. It was very true between the British and the Americans during the Second World War, for example, that there have been a lot more arguments and a lot more disagreements going on within the Allied forces in Donbass than we are aware of at the moment. During the Second World War, the British and the Americans pretended that it was a sort of seamless operation, that the two armies were working together without any friction. That was what people in the United States and Britain were being told. Subsequently, we discovered that there were all kinds of quarrels and arguments between people like Montgomery and Patton and Eisenhower and Mark Clark and Alexander going on. And there's still an extensive literature about this in Britain, most of which I haven't read, by the way. But anyway, we've learnt that there were lots of disagreements and there were echoes of it all going through my childhood and television programs, I remember. But of course, that wasn't what people knew at the time. And I suspect it's going to turn out to be the same with the fighting in Donbass. It's important to stress, none of this is going to have any effect on the eventual outcome. Eventually, all of Donbass, Donetsk region in its entirety, will be cleared of Ukrainian forces. It may be that if things had been done one way as opposed to another, that might have been achieved more quickly. Though in the nature of things, one can never know. But anyway, I suspect, as I said, that there's been some arguments. Let's not overstress this, and we will find out more about them eventually, and that this explains some of the pattern of the fighting. It also explains something else, by the way, and that is why we're so much better informed about what's going on in Donbass than we are about what's been going on in places like Ugledar in southern Donetsk, and of course in Kherson region opposite Nikolaev, and in Kharkov region. There, as I said previously, it is the regular Russian army that is doing the fighting. It's not the militia. And the regular Russian army is under very tight discipline and information control. Moscow has very tight control of what the information is that comes out. And the difference in Donbass is obviously greater because, of course, you're talking about militia. These people will want to keep in touch with their families. They will want to keep their families informed of what is happening and that they're safe and well. And of course, that inevitably means that information trickles out more extensively than it does where the regular army is in charge. So that's how we can have, big Russian advances in places like Nikolaev and Ugledar and Kharkov, about which we are singularly ill-informed, whereas we know down to the smallest village what is going on in Donbass. Anyway, that, it seems to me, gives us a fair picture of where we're going. Russians closing in on Nikolaev, probably closing in on Kharkov, steadily clearing Donetsk region, working towards encircling Bakhmut, which is the major linchpin of the Ukrainian fortifications in what left of Ukrainian-controlled Donbass. If Bakhmut falls, I suspect that what we will see is that the position of the Ukrainian forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will become extremely desperate. And I suspect that at that point, we will start to hear again more criticisms within Ukraine of Ukrainian leadership, and more information about quarrels, arguments between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky, with General Zaluzhny quite possibly calling on President Zelensky to agree to the withdrawal of those forces from Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and for their redeployment to more defendable positions, perhaps west of the Dnieper River. Anyway, that's where it seems to me we are. Now, if you go to the Western media, you're not getting any of this. Instead, what they've been filled with is all sorts of flesh-creeping talk of some major Russian strikes today, which happens to be Ukraine Independence Day. I don't believe any of it. I don't think this is how the Russians conduct their war in Ukraine. I don't think that the Russians are going to launch missile strikes all across Ukraine. Now, this brings me to another topic, which is one that's been interestingly lots of people about this pending session of the Russian Parliament. And there is a bill which is working its way through the Russian Parliament to declare Ukraine a terrorist state. And it could be that that bill will come into effect. Now, the Military Summary Channel did an update about this Parliament bill. It had previously speculated that the Parliament would announce some changes to Russian nuclear doctrines. I didn't take that. I didn't agree with that. I thought that was certainly wrong. And I've noticed that now the Military Summary Channel is much more plausibly suggesting that what's going to come is that there's going to be an announcement that the Russians are going to recognize Ukraine as a so-called terrorist state. And this might be, by the way, overspill from the attack, the murder of Daria Dugina in Moscow, which the Russians are blaming on Ukraine. Now, I think this is much more plausible, but I'm not absolutely sure that it is what the Russians are going to do. I would have thought, and this is my guess, that a more likely thing that we're going to see from the Russian Parliament is moves to authorize spending for the future reconstruction of the Donbass. Remember, Russian Parliament has to approve that. It would be Russian budget spending, and quite likely, quite plausibly, coming from what Denis Pushilin was talking about a referendum in Donetsk region. Once Donetsk region has been cleared, there might be some steps by the Russian Parliament to prepare for that, for the referendums that we know are going to happen in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, apparently in September. And quite plausibly, there's going to be referendums in Donetsk and Lugansk region before very long too, and the Russian parliament might be working towards that end, and that's presumably why the head of the Russian parliament, Mr. Slutsky, has been to Donetsk region and speaking to people like Bushilin there. That seems to me the more likely explanation for this parliamentary session. But it could also be, given the extent of Russian anger over the assassination of Daria Dugina, and given the universal belief amongst all Russians that Ukraine was behind it, something which, by the way, whether it is true or not, is what all Russians believe. And as I've said, the case that the Russian authorities have produced is a strong one. Well, given that that is the case, it could very well be that we will also have a decision to designate Ukraine as a terrorist state. Now, as has been correctly pointed out by the Military Summary Channel, that probably would clear the way for the Russians to take direct action against these decision-making centers, as the Russians refer to them. In other words, the government headquarters in Donetsk, in Kiev, the general staff, the Ukrainian general staff in Kiev, and those sort of people. Whether the Russians would actually do that, that's another matter. I am less convinced about the other suggestion made by the Military Summary Channel, that declaring Ukraine a terrorist state will somehow clear the way for the Russians to switch off gas supplies to Europe. Perhaps it would, but I'd like to see some more signs of that before I assumed it was the case. Anyway, it's possible that that's what's coming. I would say, and I would just add this word of caution, that we've had meetings at the Russian parliament in the past. There's been much excited anticipation of what it portends. People have expected that there would be huge, dramatic announcements. I remember there was a meeting of the Russian parliament a few weeks ago, and there was lots of speculation that it was going to authorize a general mobilization of the Russian military and of the Russian economy to bring this war to a swift and victorious conclusion. I was skeptical. My skepticism was absolutely right, justified. The parliament did meet, but none of these sweeping mobilization laws that people expected materialized. And I would say that I would not be surprised personally if we saw the same thing with this parliamentary session again. I think people need to be a little bit more measured in their expectations of what the Russian parliament will do. It seems to me that the Russians are proceeding confidently in the way they are conducting this war, and I don't think they need to take some of these dramatic steps that some people expect. Anyway, today I have focused in this video overwhelmingly on the military side of things. In future videos I'm going to revert again to the political economic side. But this has been a long video and I'm going to stop at this point. And obviously I would remind you that you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, and of course Telegram. And also you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. The links are under this video, and if you've been able to follow this video and liked it, please remember to press the like button, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Another, as I said, more perhaps political economic update from me soon. And have a very good day until then, and more from me, as I said, soon.